The sound of a blade being pulled out was heard. And yes, the young man was not mistaken. If he does not confess now, it will be the last time in his life. The man in the hood is not joking. Another moment, and he will plunge the sword. But he lets her have her say. The young man calms down and begins to speak. But at that very moment he feels a sharp pain. Falling to his knees and bending over in pain, he decides to look the killer in the eyes. The man in the hood looks indifferent. He has no regrets. He did everything right. A cozy, bright room, filled with sunlight, with a classic-style sofa and a coffee table in the middle of the room. An atmosphere of coziness and comfort. Celine sat on the sofa, sipping tea and calmly reading a book, not waiting for anyone. Suddenly, Wilfred opens the door and enters the room, smiling at Celine. Wilfred crouches in front of Celine and, looking into her eyes, tells the girl how much he missed her. Suddenly, Celine notices that Wilfred's shirt is dirty. She looks at it in bewilderment, waiting for an answer. Wilfred noticed Celine's gaze and was a little embarrassed. He didn't expect there to be marks left. Celine immediately guessed everything, lowering her eyes. Wilfred was worried that this would be a reason for their separation. But Celine, overcoming herself, smiled at Wilfred. He was very glad that everything worked out. But in his head, the thoughts were completely different. Celine, seeing her sister, joyfully ran to her. But Adele pretended not to see her and quickly walked away. A little later in the garden of the house, Celine also wanted to talk to Adele, but the maids did not let her do so. At the house, Celine tried to talk to Adele again, but the maids were ordered not to allow Celine to see Adele. Celine sat at her desk in her room, frantic about how she could establish contact with Adele. When she thought it over, she decided to first go on a diet and take up running. In front of us is a beautiful and well-kept park of the mansion. Celine was running along the path in the park. It was very difficult for her. She was tired, and suddenly she tripped. Raising her head, she saw her mother and sister in front of her, who were looking at her with bewilderment and fear. Celine pretended that everything was fine and ran on. Her father watched her jogging from the window. Every day, Celine's father asked the butler what she was doing, to which he gave only one answer, that she was just running. This made my father very worried and alert. The whole family gathered in the dining room. Father, mother, and Adele. Celine sat opposite her sister. Adele looks at her sister in bewilderment and doesn't eat anything. Celine, on the contrary, was in a very good mood, but she served herself a smaller portion. Father began to sternly ask if Celine was up to something and why she was behaving like this. Celine looks questioningly at her father and does not understand him. Celine guesses what is going on and decides that it is time to change the way people think about her. Celine begins to ask for forgiveness, that she regrets and admits her mistakes, that envy of her sister overshadowed her, to which Adele and everyone else were very surprised. Celine had tears in her eyes and sincerely asked to start studying again and send her a teacher. The father, being in shock from everything, decided to think about this question. Celine curtsied and thanked her father. A week later, the same mansion. Celine also continues to run and is very pleased with her results. One day while jogging, Celine ran into Adele. Adele greeted her politely and wanted to say something else. The conversation between the girls was interrupted by the maid, who covered Adele's mouth with her hand. Celine stood in the middle of the path and looked at them in surprise. Celine decided not to get upset and continue her run. Suddenly, a black cat appeared in her path. Celine squatted down and decided to pet the cat. The cat was clearly hostile and scratched Celine. The girl pretended that nothing had happened and tried to pet the cat again. This time she succeeded, and the cat calmly allowed herself to be picked up. Suddenly, the cat jumps out of the girl's hands and runs away. Celine decided to catch up with him and ran after him. Suddenly, someone calls out to her. It was a fair-haired, handsome young man. It was Prince Louis Percival. Celine looks at him, mesmerized. Celine and Louis begin to greet each other in a friendly manner. Celine remembered how much she and her sister liked him, so Adele wanted to tell her something. Celine felt awkward meeting Louis like that, Louis looked at Celine in a friendly manner, and Celine thought how good he was. Adele saw the conversation between Louis and Celine and was very excited. But Celine calmed Adele and explained that the meeting was just a coincidence. And then the thought flashed through Celine's head that if she made it so that she didn't care about Louis, Celine immediately said goodbye and ran on. Adele, Louis, and the servants stood with their mouths open, clearly not expecting such a turn of events. Adele wanted her sister back, but Celine just apologized and moved on. Louis remained standing there, not understanding anything. Celine's room. Celine sat at the table and studied hard under the stern gaze of the teacher. The teacher checked Celine's assignments. After successfully completing the tasks, the father hires a teacher for Celine on a permanent basis. Celine tries harder to study books, to learn more about this world, and understand how to use magic. After reading the book, Celine decides to take up physical exercise. The hall at Eldred's mansion. The maids discuss the changes in Celine. One of them believes that a person can change, while the others do not. Celine is very pleased that her changes are bearing fruit. Celine lies on the grass and is very happy that the weight is starting to go away. The girl decides to do a couple more exercises and stretches her arms forward. Suddenly, she notices a strange shadow near the tree. There was a young man lying on the grass under a tree. He clearly needed help. Celine made sure to press her ear to his chest to make sure he was alive. Lifting the boy to his feet, she saw strange patterns on his chest. Celine decides to bring him into the house. Having laid him on the bed, Celine called the doctor. Celine was very worried about this boy and wanted everything to work out. The doctor examined the young man and thought about it and said that it was a curse. Celine walked up to the bed and looked at the boy with concern, as if he was familiar to her. While the young man lay asleep, Celine sat next to him and looked for something to remove the curse. The doctor also came and examined him, but the doctor gave a disappointing prognosis. Celine understood that everyone in the house was afraid of curses. Mr. Eldred was furious that Celine brought the boy into the house. Celine defended the young man in every possible way, and that she could not leave him there. The father could not understand why she was fighting so fiercely for a stranger. Celine couldn't answer him. She remembered herself when she was sick with an incurable disease. How lonely she was, how everyone turned away from her. She convinces her father that she can handle everything herself and that the boy will not bother anyone. As she walked to her room, Celine heard the maids talking about a terrible curse, but she was determined to help the young man and began to think about how to get the holy water she had read about in the book. An idea came to Celine's mind to sell all her clothes and buy holy water with the money. The maids were shocked by this decision, but Celine was adamant and asked them to do it as quickly as possible. The servants were afraid of the curse, but they obeyed the order. Celine knew she was doing the right thing. When Celine came into the boy's room, she found him with a fever. She took his hand and asked only one thing, that he wait until they brought the holy water. Since no one was helping Celine, she had to look after the young man herself. She took a bowl of water and went for ice. In the corridor, she met Adele, accompanied by maids, who rushed to Celine in panic with questions. Celine, pretending that everything was fine, went to the kitchen. Adele couldn't believe that Celine was alone looking after the boy she had found. Celine says goodbye to her sister and leaves. Kitchen, the smell of food, and many different things. The cook looks at Celine in bewilderment and shows where to find what. Celine takes the ice herself because she promised her father to do everything herself. Celine thanks the cook and leaves. The cook and the maid look at her in surprise, walking down the hallway with a bowl of ice water. Celine realizes that it is so simple, and it becomes difficult for her. Suddenly, someone snatches the bowl from her hands. She looks up and sees the smiling face of the maid. The maid decides to help Celine carry the bowl to the room where the boy lies. Celine thanks the maid, but she tries to continue helping her. Here, Celine tells her about the curse, but the maid is not afraid and continues to look after the boy. Celine was very happy and thanked the maid again. The maid said that Celine could now count on her and call her when needed. Celine had a strange feeling. as if she were talking to a friend, and she liked this feeling. Living room of Eldred's house. Celine twirls a small bottle of holy water in her hands. Celine sits in her room and sighs sadly that she was able to buy so little holy water with the money she earned. She pours all the water into the boy's mouth. Celine sits down next to him and waits to see what will happen. Sitting next to the boy's bed, Celine falls asleep. Some sound wakes her up. Celine rubs her eyes and sees the boy sitting in front of her on the bed, looking at her with fear. Celine jumps up quickly with joy, touches him by the elbow, and says her name. The boy pushes her away, and Celine herself gets scared. The boy grabbed his elbow, and his gaze became unkind. Celine understands that he is scared and tries to get acquainted. She began to tell how she found him. The young man didn't make a sound, but simply listened. Celine kept chatting and telling stories, and the young man sat in bed and listened. Celine decided to leave the young man alone and left the room. As Celine left the room, she was glad that he had woken up. The next morning, Celine entered the room to see her new guest in a good mood. The boy was sitting on the bed and was very sad. Celine hurried to open the window so that fresh air could invigorate the distrustful guest. Celine offers the boy breakfast, but the boy remained sitting on the bed and did not pay attention to the food. Then Celine decides to leave the food on the table. At lunchtime, Celine brought flowers to the boy's room. In the evening, she brought him a change of clothes and underwear. The next day, Celine came to the boy again in the hope that he would tell her something. Celine tried in every way to attract his attention, but he remained silent. And even when the boy once again refused to eat, she did not lose hope that he would speak again. Celine was very upset that the boy did not eat anything. In the kitchen, Celine startled the cook when she brought back food that the boy had not eaten, by bowing and apologizing for his needless suffering in preparing the food. As she left the kitchen, Celine still asked her to cook for him. Evening, Celine's room. Celine lay on her bed, sobbing into her pillow. She was already beginning to regret bringing this young man into the house. Here she rolled over onto her back and began to drive away bad thoughts. The next day, Celine entered the boy's room with a satisfied look and brought food, which she praised. But the boy seemed not to see or hear her. Then Celine decided to try bringing the spoon to his mouth. But then the spoon flew down. The boy forcefully knocked the spoon out of Celine's hands, and it fell to the floor. Celine was very scared at first, but then, pulling herself together and calming down, she said that she didn't want to scare him at all. Celine dropped to her knees to clean up the spilled food from the floor, and suddenly she began to cry. She didn't want the boy to see her tears, and, under a simple pretext, ran out of the room. The guy remained sitting and silent. Night fell. Finally, changes began to occur in the young man. He got out of bed, holding his hand. In agony, he headed for the exit. As he walked out into the corridor, he heard the maids talking. The young man listened and was surprised at what Celine had done for him. After listening to the conversation to the end and realizing that Celine was being treated with hostility here, he went back to the room. Morning came. Celine was carrying breakfast to the young man again and was worried about how to behave now after yesterday. Entering the room, she immediately hurried to apologize for yesterday's behavior. The boy sat on the couch and silently listened to her. Celine notices that he has changed into new clothes. Celine places a tray of food in front of him and offers him something to eat. The guy still sat there with a sad look and remained silent. Celine decides to leave him alone. Suddenly, she froze in surprise and opened her eyes wide. The guy started eating. The guy ate in silence, and Celine was simply delighted. A little later in the kitchen, Celine ran happily into the kitchen and reported everything that the boy had eaten. In the kitchen, this news also made everyone happy. The cook and the maid Jenna began to discuss further how and what to cook. Listening to them, Celine was so glad that her efforts were not in vain. The Eldred family at the dinner table. Celine was eating her lunch with delight when she was interrupted by her father's question. The father asked her about the boy she had brought. Celine was very happy to tell us that everything was getting better. Celine's father was clearly surprised. Then the father announced that the reception of the first prince would soon take place, and he was concerned that Celine did not take any pocket money at all. Surprised by this news, she asked her sister what she would wear. Celine praises that Adele will look beautiful in any outfit, and then she says something she didn't intend to say. Adele looks at her, stunned. Suddenly, Adele jumps up and demands that Celine choose a dress for her. Celine remembered all the failed attempts to get along with Adele. Celine agrees to help Adele. The parents are very happy that the girls are together. A little later, in the boys' room, Celine sat in her thoughts. Then she asked if she needed to buy him anything. She was going through different things to buy in her head, and suddenly remembered that she didn't even know his name. Celine decides to ask his name. The boy hesitates, and Celine waits with bated breath. The boy quietly says his name. Celine is simply delighted. Celine doesn't forget to thank him. The girl is so happy and hopes to get closer to Will. Palace of the First Prince. Louis sits at the table and drinks coffee alone. There are 3 envelopes on the table in front of him. His solitude is broken by the butler. Louis tells the butler what worries him. The butler consoles him a little. Louis realizes that he is right. Louis opens the envelope with Celine's reply. Meanwhile, Celine and Adele go shopping at the store. Celine is delighted that they picked a great outfit for Adele. Adele is a little embarrassed. In the store, Celine can't stop at just one thing. She thinks they are all very good. She is ready to buy everything. In the joyful bustle, Adele notices that it wouldn't hurt to look at Celine's dress too. Adele asks hesitantly and apprehensively if she can choose him. To her surprise, Celine agrees. Celine's new dress was gorgeous. The girls were delighted. Then they sat in a cafe and drank a cup of coffee. The girls bought themselves identical hairpins. Once home, Celine was glad that her shopping trip had brought her pleasure. She thanks her sister for the time spent. Adele makes a surprised face, but Celine continues to speak happily. Suddenly, Celine notices that something is happening to Adele. Adele clenches her hands into fists. Celine doesn't understand what happened and rushes to Adele, who is crying. Celine tries to calm her sister down. Adele's tears flowed even more intensely. Celine hugs her sister. Celine and Adele were sitting in the room, holding hands. Adele dozed off, and Celine was thinking. And then the thought takes hold of her that she must do everything possible to make Adele happy. After crying, Celine's eyes became swollen and red. She came into Will's room with eyes like that. Celine brought him gifts. Celine pulled out a bunch of new clothes from the box. Then she took out various sweets. Then she took out different toys, as she did not know which ones would be suitable for the boy. Will sat there, simply stunned by everything. Adele admitted that she really wanted to please him, but that she got a little carried away. Will sat silently on the couch. Then he squeezed the blanket with his hand hard. Will thanks Celine, who didn't expect this from him. Celine is so happy and asks Will not to be shy and to use everything she brought. Celine was over the moon. It was truly a happy day for her. A month has passed. Jenna was helping Celine with her hair in her room. When Jenna finished, Celine thanked her. Jenna was now Celine's personal servant. During the times when Celine behaved disgustingly, the maids ran away from her, and the place was free. So when her father started talking about a maid, Celine immediately chose Jenna. Jenna noticed that Celine had lost weight. Celine agrees with her, but says that the result is still far away. Celine decided to go to Will. On her way to Will, she meets her stepmother and Adele. Celine greets them happily. Celine is very happy that she has a good relationship with her stepmother and Adele. Adele suggests that Celine prepare sweets for the afternoon. On a happy note, the girls say goodbye. In a good mood, Celine enters Will's room. Will sat at the table, dressed in new clothes, reading a book. Will greeted Celine. Celine patted him on the head and praised him for his efforts in his studies. Time passed, and Will was practically healthy and could go about his daily activities. Will still hasn't told Celine about his past. Celine was Will's substitute teacher. Will was grateful to Celine. Celine was simply happy. For Celine, Will became like a little brother. Thanks to Celine's efforts, the maids began to avoid and fear her less. Celine invites Will to go for a walk. While Will was thinking about what to answer, Celine had already grabbed his hand and led him outside. While walking through the park, Celine kept asking about Will's well-being. In one place in the park, they found mushrooms. Will warns Celine that mushrooms give her stomach aches. Will admits that he ate them when he was hungry. Celine confesses to Will that she believes in love and is waiting for a prince. Celine informs him that Will will be alone all day tomorrow. She tells him about the royal reception. Will asks about Adele. Celine admits that Adele is her #1 priority. Not noticing that Will is upset, Celine says goodbye to him. Royal reception. Celine and Adele attended the royal reception in their new outfits. There were many different guests at the reception. Celine liked it here. She looked around at everything. It was her first time at a reception. At the reception, Celine and Adele met 2 girls Adele knew. The girls were extremely surprised and unhappy to see Celine next to Adele. Celine guessed why she was being greeted like that, but she greeted the girls sweetly. Even young people, upon seeing Celine, began to whisper to each other. Everyone turned their attention to Celine, but they also noticed changes in her. Celine heard all this whispering and felt the glances in her direction. She felt uneasy. Celine decides to leave Adele and go for a walk alone. But at the last moment, Adele grabs her and stops her. The guests were clearly shocked by what they saw. While Adele was telling Celine that she was glad they came together, a human figure was approaching them. It was Prince Louis. He greeted both girls. The girls curtsied to him. Celine really liked Louis. Celine thought it would be a good idea to leave Adele and Louis alone. As soon as Celine came up with an excuse to leave, she heard that Adele was already leaving. Celine clearly didn't expect this turn of events. She was very sorry that she had not told Adele what she thought about the prince. Celine tries to detain Adele. Louis, on the contrary, seems very happy. The prince took Celine by the hand, and they walked past the guests. Celine still couldn't believe it. Celine was worried that she didn't know what to talk about with the prince. Louis spoke first. Celine admitted that she wanted to change herself. Celine told Louis everything as it was. Louis listened to her attentively. Then Celine remembered that she had caused problems for Louis too. Louis began to take an interest in Celine's training. Celine was pleased that her father noticed her efforts. Celine decides to tell Louis about her weight loss. Louis compliments her. Celine thanks him jokingly and does not take the prince's words seriously. Celine and Louise were walking, and the prince was interested in her philology studies. A little later, they said goodbye. Celine watched the prince leave and thought about the future. Here Louise stopped and asked if he could meet Celine again. Celine was happy. She thought about Adele first and foremost. Celine is pleased with herself. Celine goes back and finds a cheerful Adele. Adele, Celine, and Will are sitting in a room together drinking tea and talking. Celine reports that she did not make any friends during the reception. Adele consoles her with words. Celine hints that Will needs friends too. He confesses to Celine that she is his only friend. This confession touched Celine. She hugs Will and is glad that he is attached to her. Adele asks if Celine likes Will. Celine, still holding Will in her arms, admits that he is like a little brother to her. Here, Adele remembered about the reception and that Celine had been talking to the prince for a long time. Celine tells Adele that she is not interested in the prince. Adele is surprised by her confession because Celine used to adore Louis. Listening to the girls' conversation, Will wonders who Louis is. Upon learning that Celine liked the prince, Will clenches his fists. Duke Eldred's house. Celine notices the commotion in the house due to the prince's arrival. During her classes with Will, Celine is amazed by his memory. Celine was lost in her thoughts. Suddenly, Will drew her attention to the window. Prince Louis Percival arrived at the Duke's house. Will compares himself to the prince. Celine is surprised by Will's thoughts. A maid entered the room and asked Miss Celine to come down for tea. Celine looks at the maid in confusion. She leaves Will and walks away. Will grabs her hand. He doesn't want Celine to leave. Celine reassures Will that she won't be gone for long. Will, holding her hand tightly, insists on his own. This is the first time Celine sees him in this state. Celine breaks free from his arms. She needs to go. They are waiting for her. Will is left alone in the room. Meanwhile, in the living room of Duke Eldred's house, Louis notices that Celine is a bit quiet. Celine is trying to come up with something on the fly. Adele joins the conversation. Celine notices that they only talk to her. Celine sat and sweetly kept up the conversation, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Celine is becoming more and more irritated by the attention Adele and Louis pay to her. She reports business and wants to leave. Louis clearly didn't expect such a short conversation with Celine. Adele remembers Will. Louis was even more shocked than by Celine's quick departure. Adele told the prince how Will came to be in their house. Louis wonders why she decided to court him herself. Celine answered Louis, but kept silent about the main thing. Louis decides to see this Will. Celine doesn't really like this idea. In the following days, Louis came again. Celine was very stressed about this. After seeing Louis off, Celine once again asks the butler about the prince's frequent visits. The butler informs Celine that the prince is choosing a bride. Celine consoles herself with the thought that it is Adele and not her. In the library, Celine and Will are reading a book. Will is worried about the frequent meetings between Celine and the prince. Celine just laughed. Celine is worried that Will doesn't want to communicate with anyone but her. She invites him to go to the park with her. Eldred House Park. Celine notices the blossoming flowers. The girl tries to find out what Will likes. Will's answer clearly shocked her. Will takes her hand in his and wants to know how much she likes him. Celine looks at him and doesn't know what to answer. Will confesses his feelings to her. Celine, pretending not to understand Will, says that he is important to her too. They continued to walk through the park in silence. Suddenly, Will stopped abruptly. Celine sees that Prince Louis has arrived again. Celine was very surprised by the prince's appearance. Her father said that it was he who invited Louis. Louis turns his attention to the young man standing next to Celine. For some time, the young people studied each other closely. Louis decided to break the silence first. Will didn't answer, but only looked angrily at the prince. As Celine had predicted, it would have been better if this meeting had never happened. Celine decides to intervene in the conversation. Suddenly, Will turns her around and leads her away. Celine apologizes and leaves with Will. Will's room. Celine tries to understand what is happening to Will. Celine hugs Will tightly. Evening came. Celine guessed that something from the past had affected Will. Celine encourages him. Will understands everything in his own way and grabs Celine with his hand. Celine thinks that Will is just afraid of being alone. She again remembers herself in the hospital room. She hugs Will and promises to be with him. While doing her hair, Jenna compliments Celine. Celine is glad that the maids have started to communicate with her more. Celine mentions Adele and Louis in conversation, but Jenna tells her some interesting news. Celine thinks in surprise. Then the image of Wilfred appears before her. Celine asks about the plans for the day. Celine studies hard and also diligently practices magic. After classes in the park, Adele, Celine, and Will are having a nice time. Strange thoughts appear in Celine's head. Celine becomes more and more lost in her thoughts. Returning back to the guys, Celine turns to Will. Celine notices that Will doesn't respond right away. The girl makes Will say something right away if something is wrong. Adele announces that it's time to go home. Celine wonders what to do at home. When they returned, the girls said goodbye to Wilfred. Celine invites her sister to play. Night, Wilfred's room. Will is not sleeping. Something is bothering him. The curse pattern appears on his body again. Will falls to the floor. Celine looked at herself in the mirror. She was embarrassed when the butler noticed her doing this. Between classes, Celie continued to run and follow a diet. But next to her, if she stood next to her sister, Adele was still slimmer. Celine is thinking about how to further speed up her weight loss process. Celine is very happy with the butler's hints. She thanks him and goes about her business. Living room of Eldred's house. The guests were delighted with Celine's invitation. Celine thanks everyone for agreeing to come to her for tea. Mom suggested that Celine have a tea party so that Celine would have a chance to make friends. Celine tried to be friendly and outgoing to make an impression. Adele praised Celine. Celine was grateful to her sister for this. Celine began to realize that hosting guests would be a failure for her. A certain person approached Celine. A beautiful green-eyed girl was looking at Celine. It was Wilhelmina. Wilhelmina reminded Celine of her past pranks on Adele. Adele was simply furious with such conversations. Celine didn't hide anything and told what her reconciliation with Adele was like. To the surprise of the sisters, Wilhelmina was understanding. Here Wilhelmina turned her attention to the candies. Other girls also started trying, and everyone liked it. Celine couldn't believe her ears. Soon, all the girls were chatting in a large and friendly group. While seeing Wilhelmina off, Celine asked her about the conversation in the living room. Wilhelmina pretended not to understand what Celine was talking about. And then, blushing and embarrassed, Celine asked Wilhelmina about friendship. Wilhelmina agrees. Celine even opened her mouth when she heard this. The girls agreed to meet again. At a family dinner, Celine announced that she had made a friend. Her parents were happy for her. Celine thanks Adele. Celine's father also praises her for her academic success. Celine couldn't hold back her tears of joy, because this was the first praise from her father. In Duke Eldred's park, Will helps the gardener. Celine is very pleased with Will's efforts. Wilfred gives Celine a flower. Celine is very touched by this gesture. Wilfred is very happy. Celine was very happy in this life. Will is skeptical of Celine's joy in the flower, but Celine is really happy. Will then decides to continue giving gifts to Celine. But for Celine, a healthy Will is already a gift. Then she notices that Will has become sad. Will chose not to say anything to Celine. Celine reminds Will to tell her right away if anything happens. But Celine has doubts and decides to show Will to the doctor. Celine spends her time taking magic classes. The teacher warns Celine that it won't be easy. But Celine is full of strength and optimism. They started their classes. Celine didn't succeed in her first lesson. Celine noticed a wilted flower in the flower bed. She decides to help him using her new knowledge. As she concentrates, she notices that something unusual is happening. The flower suddenly became as if it had just blossomed. The teacher interrupted her and asked her to finish the lesson. Celine obeyed him. At the house of Duke Eldred, Celine walked along in thought. For some reason, her father invited her. The thoughts in her head were very different. In the corridor, she meets Adele. Adele tells Celine that she knows why her father invited her. Celine timidly enters her father's office. In the office, there was not only the father, but also the butler and the teacher. Celine feels that something is wrong here, and that the teacher is here for a reason. Father talks to her about magic. Celine is so surprised by her father's statements that she cannot say anything. Celine insists that this is all a mistake and she cannot be a goddess. Then Celine's father asks the teacher to bring something. It was a black stone, which lay neatly on the pillow. The teacher brings a stone to Celine and asks her to touch it. As soon as Celine touches the stone, something magical happens. After removing their hand, everyone noticed that the stone had changed color. Father Celine couldn't believe his eyes. The teacher tells everyone what exactly happened. Celine doesn't believe what's happening. The teacher claims that it is Celine who possesses the magic of the goddess. The father was clearly pleased with this discovery, but Celine didn't hear them. She was looking at her hands, and a whole bunch of thoughts were swarming through her head. Celine can't believe what she's hearing. Celine is simply in a panic because she didn't want this at all. She needs to come up with something urgently. After hearing what her father said, Celine is not herself. Even during her lessons with Will, she cannot help but think about it. Celine was constantly testing her magic. Now she is worried about Adele's future, which is most likely not as happy as she wanted. Celine was even more frightened by the engagement to the prince. Will breaks her from her thoughts. Celine pretends everything is normal. Suddenly, Will felt a pain in his chest. He, like Celine, does not tell the truth. Celine decides to bring him lunch. During tea, Louis becomes interested in Celine's magic. Adele is simply delighted that magic has awakened in Celine. But Celine is modest. Celine wonders where this magic comes from anyway. Celine still does not lose hope that magic will awaken in Adele as well. While Celine struggles with her thoughts, Adele and Louis find explanations for her strange behavior. Here, Adele remembers some sweets for Celine. Adele leaves, leaving Louis and Celine alone. Disrupting Celine's thoughts, the prince invites her for a walk. To Louis' surprise, Celine asks to consult with Adele. Louis makes it clear that the walk is just for the two of them. Later in the living room, Adele calls the walk a date, but it never occurred to Celine that this was an invitation to a date. Adele notices that Celine is not very enthusiastic about this idea, and then Celine decides to ask Adele her opinion about the prince. But Adele doesn't quite understand what her sister's getting at. Then Celine asks the question more specifically. Having received Adele's answer, Celine was simply perplexed. Adele is already suggesting getting ready for a date. Celine hugs her sister, but her thoughts won't leave her alone. While visiting Wilhelmina, Celine tells her about the prince's invitation. Wilhelmina, like Adele, is also sure that this is a date. Wilhelmina notices that Celine is not particularly happy about the date. Celine shares her innermost thoughts with her. Wilhelmina convinces Celine that marriage for love is also possible. Wilhelmina gives an example of such a marriage. Celine and Wilhelmina flirt like real friends. Celine's room. Celine is getting ready for a date. Celine gives Jenna instructions about Will. Celine called a doctor for him without Will's knowledge. Visiting the prince, Celine and Prince Louis talk about their day. Louis mentions Celine's magic. Smiling at Louis, she is very depressed inside. Louis suggests trying something else. Louis's words reminded Celine of Will. Louis offers to give Celine a ride home before it's too late. On the street, Celine will hear someone crying. Celine runs up to the boy. Celine notices the boy's broken knee. Unable to come up with anything better, Celine decides to use her power. The boy was simply shocked by what he saw, but Celine, smiling sweetly, only put her index finger to her mouth. The prince watched this whole story. Soon, Louis brought Celine home, and they agreed to meet again. Returning to the house, Celine first went to Jenna. Before Celine had time to ask, Adele ran out screaming. Adele could only say Will's name with tears in her eyes. Celine immediately ran into Will's room, where he was lying on the bed like he had been months ago. Celine realized that Will had been ill for a long time. She remembers about holy water, but the doctor says it won't help now. Celine just can't believe there are no more ways to help Will. Jenna reminds Celine that she needs to go to the temple tomorrow. She also brings Celine some food and a book. Celine flips through the book without any interest. In the book, Celine finds something about the goddess's magic. She decides to try her magic on Will. She takes Wilfred's hand and tries to help him. Celine did not give up and endured all the pain that came from this curse. Celine is lying in bed in her room. The first thing Celine sees when she opens her eyes is the frightened faces of her maid and sister. At this point, Celine suddenly jumps up and asks about Will. Celine was so happy that Will was feeling better. But Adele wasn't particularly happy that Celine did this. Celine asks if her father was informed about what happened. Celine realizes that Adele had to lie. Jenna says that we need to get ready for the temple. Adele reassures her sister that she will look after Will. In the temple, Celine learns that she has virtually no goddess magic. Father Celine is simply furious at what he heard, but the temple representative insisted on his own. Celine was only happy about this news, but deep down she felt guilty towards her father. After the temple, Celine immediately hurried to Will. Celine began to ask about his health. Suddenly, she fell silent, because another Will was looking at her, or rather, a Will with a different color of eyes. Celine wanted to ask Will himself about the eyes. Finally, her thoughts began to come together into a coherent picture. Celine decides to ask Will about his origins. Will apologizes for keeping his origins from Celine. Celine doesn't hold a grudge against him. Wilfred gives his real name. Will is worried that now something will change between him and Celine. But Celine makes it clear to him that everything will be as before. Suddenly, Will presses himself against Celine. Wilfred doesn't want to lose Celine. Celine promises that she will not leave him. They decide to keep Will's origins a secret from everyone. Celine asks Will not to show himself to anyone. Night, Celine's room. Celine is completely at a loss. She doesn't know what to do next. All these thoughts make her cry bitterly. Wilfred can't sleep. He wants to see Celine again. Putting on his cap, he decides to leave the room. As he passes one of the rooms, he hears a snippet of conversation that leaves him in shock. Adele and Jenna have a heart-to-heart talk. Then a brilliant idea comes to Will. The next morning, Celine immediately rushes to Will. But when she entered his room, a strange picture appeared before her. Will tells Celine that he intends to go to the royal castle. Celine is speechless from what she hears. Celine doesn't understand what happened during the night. Will intends to become a prince again. Celine is worried about him. Duke Eldred enters the room. Father tells Celine that he knows everything about Will. Will sat silently next to Celine. Celine realized that her father knew about her lie and began to ask for forgiveness. But the Duke had other thoughts about Celine's actions. Celie couldn't believe that her father didn't hold a grudge against her. Celie is glad that there will be no engagement with Louis now. Duke Eldred takes Wilfred under his protection. The Duke conveys to Celine the plan that must be followed. Celie worries that if Will returns to the royal castle, he will forget her. Will asks Celine for forgiveness. Celine wants to know why Will made this decision. Will wanted to say something, but then he just hugged Celine. Celine hugged him back as if this was their last meeting. Both admit their sympathy for each other. Of course, Adele knew about everything. Celine is pleased that Adele is now out of danger. Suddenly, the Duke announces that Celine is waiting for Louis. Celine is extremely surprised by his visit. Prince Louis asks Celine a strange question. Celine doesn't understand what he's talking about. Louis knows that Celine has the power of a goddess. Louis told Celine that he saw her heal the boy. Celine didn't know what to answer and only repeated the Archbishop's words. Celine wonders why Louis is so nervous. It is important for Louis to know how Celine feels about him. And the prince says what Celine feared most. Celine was shocked by the prince's words. Louis notices his interlocutor's confusion. Celine finds something to answer. Then the prince decides to win the heart of his beloved girl. While Celine was talking to the prince, Adele and Will spent time together. Celine returns to Willa and Adele. She tries to hide her inner turmoil. She told them that her father had not told her anything special. The day has come when Will sets off for the kingdom. Celine gives Will some parting words. Celine can't hold back her tears. Finally, Wilfred tells Celine about his feelings for her. Celine reciprocates. Celine's room. Celine is waiting for her father to return. Celine constantly thinks about Will and continues her studies. The Duke's arrival made Celine very happy. Father tells Celine how Will is doing. As soon as Celine started talking about meeting Will, her father stopped abruptly. The Duke informs Celine that there can be no talk of any meeting with Prince Wilfred. Celine wants to know the reason. The Duke tells all the conditions under which Celine will be able to see Will again. The father calms his daughter down and says that this is how it should be. But the Duke also brings good news for Celine. Without further ado, Celine immediately began writing the letter. Celine and Adele were invited to Wilhelmina's birthday party. This time the girls are the first to greet the sisters. Celine decides to take a little walk alone. But as soon as she steps out onto the balcony, she freezes in amazement. Celine is very surprised that the prince is here. Louis invites her to come with him for some fresh air. Celine is mesmerizing to look at. Here Louis starts talking about Will. Celine doesn't hide the fact that she misses him. Celine is worried about whether the brothers see each other. Celine confesses to Louis that Wilfred is very dear to her. Celine notices some changes in the prince. The prince only asks her to return to the guests. Adele and Celine chat over a cup of tea in the garden. Jenna brings a letter from Wilfred. After reading the letter, Celine cannot contain her emotions. The girls are glad that everything is fine. Celine decides to study hard so that she can meet Will in all his glory. Duke Eldred's house 6 years later. Adele and Jenna discuss Celine and Wilfred's upcoming meeting. Jenna tells Celine that the crew is ready and waiting just for her. Celine is really looking forward to meeting Will. Celine is looking forward to the meeting. Celine goes to the royal castle. Celine was so nervous the whole way that she didn't even notice she had arrived. The royal castle was simply magnificent. A maid meets her at the castle. While waiting for Will, Celine dozed off. Celine, half asleep, cannot understand anything. But then she throws herself on Will's neck in joy. Celine notices that Will has matured. Finally getting a full look at Will, she just can't believe it's him. Will notices that Celine is acting strangely, but Celine reassures him that everything is fine. Wilfred gently touches Celine's face and compliments her. Will wants to get a closer look at Celine's face. Celine is clearly perplexed by this turn of events. The maid disturbs Will and Celine's privacy. Celine takes a breath. Wilfred grabs Celine's hand and cuddles up to her. He missed her very much. Celine feels awkward. Celine can't take it anymore and pushes Will away from her. Celine changes the subject. The girl is also concerned about the health of the second prince. Wilfred wonders what Celine has been doing for the past 6 years. Will wonders if Celine has any admirers. Celine is being modest in front of Will and a little disingenuous. But Will wonders if Celine likes any of the young men. Celie was also interested in what Will did in the royal family. Wilfred answers in general terms. Will confesses to Celine that he has a goal for which he is ready to do anything. Celine is surprised at how many times Wilfred read her letters. The first thing that comes to Celine's mind is that Will was lonely in the castle, which is why he missed her so much. She assumes that Wilfred will be an eligible bachelor in the future. Will tells Celine several times that she is his lady love, but Celine does not hear him. It's time to say goodbye. Wilfred doesn't want to let Celine go. He reminds Celine of their vow. Celine, remembering her oath, repeats her words about her sympathy for Will. The second prince states that his feelings are completely different. Celine doesn't understand what Will is talking about. Will is in no hurry to reveal all his cards to Celine. Will kisses Celine gently near the ear. Celine screams in fright and abruptly gets up from the sofa. Will doesn't see anything wrong with this, because Celine did the same thing when he lived in her father's house. Wilfred hugs Celine tightly again. Celine understands that this can't happen anymore. She needs to explain to him that he needs to be able to keep his distance. Will once again lets her know that she is special to him. Celine is getting ready to go home. Celine reminds that in a week they will meet again. Holding Will's hands, Celine comforts him. Then Will says something incomprehensible. Will tries to pretend nothing happened. Celine goes home. As she left the castle, Celine was in the most positive thoughts. Here her thoughts were interrupted by Prince Louis. Prince Louis is interested in Celine's visit to the castle. Celine whispers in his ear why she came. Louis didn't show that he was bothered and simply listened to Celine. Unexpectedly for Celine, Louis moves closer and touches her face with his hand. Celine was not ready to share more frank thoughts with him. Louis walks Celine to the gate. Wilfred watched them silently from the castle window. The dining room in the house of Duke Eldred. Celine tells everyone that Will is doing well and that he has grown a lot. Celine's father is glad to hear such words from Celine. Adele is also looking forward to meeting Will. But not very good things are happening in the castle. It turns out that Will is not having an easy time living in the castle. The most terrible thoughts are floating around in Will's head. Will doesn't want Celine to know about his other side. Jenna is sincere in her comments to Celine about her beauty. Celine is a little worried because today is an important day for Will. Both sisters are in great spirits. Parents rush the girls, who can't stop looking at each other. Evening in the royal castle. The castle's living room is filled with the most important guests. The Duke assumes that they are late for the ceremony. A crowd of people gathered around Wilfred. Adele is speechless from surprise as she looks at Will. Will notices Celine. The girls bow their heads before him as if he were a real prince. Will is not particularly happy about this meeting. Celine understands that there is no other way for now. Celine leaves without saying goodbye to Will. Celine sees the Duke talking to the Queen. After overhearing part of the conversation, Celine begins to understand that the Queen is not very happy with Will. The Queen notices Celine. The Queen says she has heard about Celine from Louis. After talking with the Queen, Celine, Adele, and her father move on to the guests. Suddenly, a hand grabs her from behind the curtain. It's Will. He points his finger at her to be quiet. Will regrets that this is the only way they can talk. Celine pats his head, which Wilfred really likes. Will hugs Celine tightly. He leans his head on her shoulder and says that it makes him feel better. Celine hugs him again and is ready to fight for his happiness. Prince Louis, who accidentally went out onto the balcony, caught them in such a tight embrace. Celine didn't notice him, but Will did. Adele asked where Celine was. While thinking about Will, Celine ran into a blonde girl. The girl apologized, considering it to be her fault. Like Celine, the lady noticed her beauty. The girl turned out to be none other than the future wife of Prince Wilfred. Celine sat in her room and wrote a letter to Will. She informed Jenna that Will would be able to come visit them next week. Celine, of course, was flattered by Will's attitude towards her. Here Jenna breaks her thoughts with the arrival of Mr. Lewis. Celine enters the living room with curiosity, because Louis said that he would not come alone. To her surprise, Louis arrived with the beauty she had encountered at the castle. The girl introduced herself as Cardelia. With mixed feelings, Celine also introduced herself to Cardelia. Cardelia complains that she has no friends here. Louis makes Celine blush a little. The girls agree to be friends. Cardelia says she heard a lot from Louis about Celine. Celine decides to ask Cardelia the purpose of her visit to another country. Cardelia's answer left Celine in shock. Here Louis put in his word. Cardelia doesn't mince words about Will. Celine sat and listened to Cardelia with concern. Louis decided to interrupt Cardelia's monologue. Celine has to agree with Louis, because she told him so herself. Cardelia still didn't calm down. Celine never imagined that it would happen like this. Celine understood that she could not refuse His Highness forever, because she was still under pressure from her father. Celine sees off the guests. Louis reminds her of the engagement. Celine doesn't know what to answer. Leaning towards Celine's ear, he said that his choice was only her. Cardelia and Louis left, and Celine was left standing there, confused. When Wilfred came to visit Celine, everyone was surprised by his changes. Wilfred notices that Celine's room has hardly changed. Will wouldn't mind returning to the Duke's house again. Celine brings up the topic of Will and Cardelia's engagement. Will pretends not to understand what Celine is talking about, and Celine explains the details. Celine realizes something is going on with Will. Will wonders what else the first prince told Celine. Celine remembers their conversation, but she doesn't dare tell Will. Will guesses what Celine is keeping quiet about. Suddenly he looms over her, which scares Celine a little. Will admits to Celine that he doesn't need money or social status, that this is just a way to get what he needs. Celine doesn't understand what Wilfred is talking about and looks at him questioningly. And Will says the words he's been carrying inside himself for a long time. Finally, the full meaning of his words reaches Celine. Will admits he didn't want to rush things. Celine is overcome with fear. He does not recognize Wilfred. Will realizes he went a bit overboard and apologizes. Celine is at a loss and doesn't know how to behave now. The girl apologizes for her inattention. Will also asks for forgiveness, but this time for his jealousy. Celine realizes that it's all about Louis. Wilfred squeezes Celine's shoulder hard and demands to know about her feelings for Louis. Will is afraid of losing Celine. Celine hugs him and comforts him with words. Will is happy to hear such words from her. Will sees that something is bothering Celine. Celine speaks out loud her feelings. Wilfred listens to her with understanding. Celine also mentions Cardelia. Wilfred is very critical of this engagement. Celine understands how Will feels, but she also understands that everything has already been decided. The prince expresses strange thoughts that frighten Celine. Celine tries to understand where Will is going with this, but their conversation is interrupted by a knock on the door. The prince is reminded of the planned meeting. Will takes Celine's hand and says that he is ready to do anything for her. Celine just can't get over his touches and conversations. He sees her off. Royal Castle, night. Wilfred walks into the room where he was expected with a serious look. A young, fair-haired man was waiting for him in the room, who was clearly already bored. The prince is not in much of a conversational mood. The prince's overnight guest leaned back on the sofa, holding a glass of wine in his hand. Will realizes that he doesn't have enough influence yet, so he drinks a glass of wine. The Marquis is informed of Will's meeting with Celine. Will doesn't know what to do with Louis. The Marquis's words only provoke Will to take action. The Marquis reports that the question of the wedding between Louis and Celine has already been decided, but the second prince has a plan. The Marquis is clearly pleased because his goals coincide with Prince Wilfred's. Back home, Celine is unusually silent. Adele notices that Celine has become somewhat quiet since her arrival. Celine decides to tell Adele everything. Perhaps she will give advice. Adele beats Celine to the punch. Celine is just shocked. How does she know? Adele admits that you have to be blind not to notice it. Celine is annoyed by her blindness, but finds an excuse for herself. Celine doesn't know what to do. Adele doesn't seem to hear Celine and adds fuel to the fire. Adele asks what Celine herself wants. Celine has always dreamed of love, but she doesn't want to go against her family either. Celine is in thought because she doesn't want to leave Will either. Celine thinks clearly and tries to find a better way out of the current situation. Adele realizes that they cannot tell either their father or Louis about the conversation between Celine and Will. Here, Celine also remembers from Cordelia, Will's possible bride. Celine was completely confused. Adele tries to somehow help her sister in her difficult choice. Celine thanks her sister for her support. But in her heart, Celine would like to be with Will. A little later in the royal castle. In the room, on the sofa, sat Cordelia and the second Prince Wilfred, and opposite them were Celine and the first Prince Louis. Cordelia kept trying to get Wilfred's attention, who was clearly not happy with such company. Louis, as befits a future groom, showed concern for Celine, who was embarrassed by such gestures in front of Will. Louis takes Celine's hands and notices that they are very cold. The first prince then carefully places his outer garment over Celine. Celine thanks His Highness for such care. Cordelia is touched by the relationship between Celine and Louis. Will is beside himself at Cordelia's words and accidentally drops his cup on the floor, which breaks. Everyone writes off the broken cup as an accident, except Celine. When Wilfred tries to pick up the shards, he injures his hand. Cordelia gasps in horror. Celine rushes to Will's aid. Celine examines the wound, but does not dare to use the power of the goddess. She takes Will to the doctor. Instead of the doctor, Celine used her power and healed the wound. To avoid any questions from Louis and Cordelia, Celine bandages Will's arm where the wound was. Arriving for tea at Cordelia's invitation, Celine never expected to find Will and Louis together. Will explained to her why this happened. Celine was still worried about Will's wound, because it was deep. But Wilfred reassured her. Will confessed to Celine that it hurt him to watch Louis touch her. Celine felt awkward. Then Wilfred took her hand and kissed it as a sign of purification. Celine was clearly not prepared for this turn of events. She kindly asks Will not to do it again, to which Will reacts in his own way. As soon as Celine said that they needed to keep their distance, it was as if Will had been replaced. Celine notices this change and tries to calm him down. There was a knock at the door. To Celine's surprise, Will became friendly and smiling again. Prince Wilfred thanks Celine for her help. Cordelia and Louis are already tired of waiting. Celine apologizes for making the first prince wait. Cordelia still did not calm down and was happy about her upcoming engagement to Mr. Wilfred. At Cardelia's jubilant cries, Will snorted that it was the first time he had heard of such a thing. But Cardelia insisted that the engagement had already been decided by the queen herself. Cardelia invites Celine to her engagement party. Celine is simply confused as to how to answer her. Before Celine could answer, Louis interrupts the conversation, thereby saving Celine from answering. Before Celine had time to rejoice, Cardelia asked her to stay alone with her. Celine has no choice but to agree to talk to Cardelia. Will was clearly not thrilled with the idea. Cardelia makes it clear to Louise that there is no need to see Celine off. Finally, Louis touches Celine's face tenderly and says that they will meet again soon. Will wanted to say something before Celine left, but she said goodbye to him in a friendly manner. The girls left the castle and went outside. Unexpectedly for Celine, Cardelia tells her the well-known news. Cardelia, with a sweet expression on her face, makes it clear to Celine that from now on, only she will be next to Prince Wilfred. Celine wanted to say something, but Cardelia interrupted her, squeezing her hand. After Cardelia left, Celine felt a pain in her chest. Will saw Celine out the window. Louis suddenly grabs Will's sore arm. After removing the bandage, Louis sees a healthy arm with no trace of a wound. The first prince immediately guesses what's going on. Wilfred pulls his hand away and leaves silently without explaining anything to his brother. On the way home, Will realizes that something needs to be done. Louis remembers today's meeting with Celine. He understands how cleverly she came up with everything, but he does not intend to back down from her. Father tells Celine that they are invited to the royal castle. The Duke thinks that the conversation will be about engagement. Célie understands that there is nothing that can be done. Father, seeing Celine's doubts, hints that everything can be cancelled. But Celine doesn't want the whole family to suffer because of her. While Celine is thinking, a maid enters the room with tea. The maid accidentally knocks over the tray, and the hot tea burns her hand. Celine rushes to her aid. The maid, clutching her burnt hand, smiles sweetly. Celine understands that she could help her, but she cannot show her strength. Celine understands that it is time to make a decision and stop torturing herself. Adele enters the room. A small cafe. Adele distracts Celine with a trip to a cafe. The sisters are chatting nicely, and Adele asks to go to another store. On the way to the store, Celine hears admiring exclamations and turns around. She sees Will in the company of a young man. Will notices her. Wilfred hugs Celine tightly in front of everyone. Celine and Will are both very happy about this meeting. But Celine had other thoughts in her head. The Marquis was very surprised at how Will changed when he met Celine. Will notices his friend. The Marquis introduces himself to Celine. In turn, Celine introduces Richard to Adele. Richard tries to be nice and polite, which Will doesn't really like. Celine inquires about Richard's status for Will. Celine is glad that Will has a friend. Celine immediately began to praise Will, who did not like it. Celine tries to guess what Will is thinking. Unexpectedly for everyone, Will invites everyone to go for a walk together. Celine is simply bursting with joy, but she is not alone and asks her sister for her consent. And Richard already knows where they should go. Celine is very happy to spend at least a little more time with Will. It was a small restaurant in the city where young people settled. Celine tries to find out more about Richard. Richard compliments Adele. Celine notices that Adele is not very happy. Wilfred tries to spoon-feed Celine. Celine understands that this should not be done. Because there is a conversation about engagement ahead, she cannot refuse. Adele and Richard have been watching Will and Celine all this time. Will asks Adele to go with him. The girls are very surprised by this. Celine noted that this was the first time that Will had invited Adele somewhere. Richard suggests that Celine take a short walk while he waits for his friends. Everyone goes their separate ways, but when Celine and Richard returned back, they saw a large crowd of people. Celine suddenly felt something bad. Pushing through the crowd, Celine saw Will lying on the road, covered in blood. Celine couldn't believe what she saw. Adele leaned over Will and tried to heal him. The power of the goddess manifested itself in Adele. The girls leaned over Will. Celine saw that Will opened his eyes and began to ask what happened. Celine watches as Adele uses her power. Suddenly, Adele becomes ill and falls. Celine is worried about her sister, but Richard manages to catch Adele. Celine rushes to Will, who has come to his senses. Wilfred gets up, but he doesn't feel well. Richard decides what to do. Richard also reminds the boys that the crowd of people is still here. People, of course, understood what had happened. The young people headed towards the carriage, and the crowd of people looked after them. 2 days passed. Will was visiting Celine. Now that it's all over, Celine smiles, but back then she allowed herself other thoughts. Celine throws herself into Wilfred's arms in tears. Will remembered Celine's words about Adele and the power of the goddess. Celine was right. Adele came to her senses the next day. Adele herself doesn't understand how this happened. Celine admits that she had the same experience. Here, Adele asks about her father. Does he know? Celine is worried about Adele, but Adele is full of optimism. The next day, Will went to visit Celine and met Adele at the castle. Celine said that after what happened, her sister was called to the castle. Will makes an interesting suggestion. Celie realizes that Will may be right. She immediately imagined Adele with Louis, but they were indifferent to each other. Wilfred reassures Celine and thinks that Adele will not agree. Celine asks who she is talking about and whether she understands Will correctly. Celine is amazed by Will's confidence. Will is glad that now his engagement to Cordelia is in question. Will clearly knew something more than Celine. Celine didn't understand where such confidence came from, because the queen had already decided everything. Wilfred notices that Celine is not particularly happy, but Celine claims that she is simply surprised by such unexpected events. Remembering the conversation with Cordelia, Celine is simply torn apart with indignation. But Will takes her hand and says that she is the only one he needs. Celine calmed down a little, but her soul was still uneasy. A little later, at Richard's house, Richard and Will are drinking tea. Wilfred admires Celine. Richard asks his friend not to rush so much, because last time he could have died. Richard insists that everything happened with Adele by accident, but Will didn't count on her help at all. He knew that Celine would help him. Here Richard casts past events in a different light. Richard was simply shocked at what Will's entire plan was based on. Will thinks Celine is not an ordinary girl. Will is pleased that so far everything is going according to his plan. Wilfred is going to hide his plan from Celine. Will is willing to do anything to get Celine. Richard looks at his friend in surprise. Is this really love? Now Will has to deal with Cordelia. Will informs Richard that Miss Cordelia is not as simple as she seems. The Marquis doesn't want to help Will with Cordelia, but then he immediately says that he likes Miss Cordelia. Night, Royal Castle. First, Prince Louis sits in his room, unable to sleep. Cordelia approaches him and speaks out loud the thoughts that torment Louis. Cordelia speaks her mind. For some reason, Louis is sure that this is not an accident, but a setup. Louis knows how the Queen feels about Wilfred. The first prince goes over all the events in his head and tries to find a clue. Louis understands that Adele can now become his bride. The decision is up to the Queen, but he only needs Celine, even though he himself doesn't know why exactly she is the one. Cordelia is sure that Louis will come up with something. As if by accident, she also throws out a phrase about herself. Louis is determined. Will's obsession scares Louis, and Louis decides to separate them as quickly as possible. But Cordelia likes Prince Wilfred even in this form. Adele returns from the royal castle with news. In the living room of Duke Eldred's house, Adele informs Will and Celine that Prince Louis is not happy with marrying her. Will gets tired of hearing about Louis. Celine suddenly asks Will if he has been coming to see her more often. To Celine's surprise, Wilfred laughs it off, but Celine still needs to resolve the issue with Cordelia. Celine wonders what position Wilfred will be in such a situation. The second prince expresses himself presumptuously, but Adele says that Prince Louis has already chosen his bride, and it is Celine. Wilfred didn't want Celine to know about this. Adele felt a little embarrassed that she had said something unnecessary. Unexpectedly for the conversation, Celine remembers about the tournament. Celine remembers how events developed in another version, and she wants to believe that now everything will be different. The day of the tournament arrived. Celine and Adele didn't expect to see so many people here, especially girls. The other girls looked at the sisters with curiosity. Adele is already ready to help everyone with her power. Celine hears a familiar voice. Cordelia appeared before Celine in all her glory. To Celine's surprise, Cordelia greeted her as an old friend. Cordelia doesn't miss the opportunity to talk to Adele. Cordelia is looking forward to the start of the tournament. The girls hear exclamations with familiar names. The first Prince Louis and the second Prince Wilfred arrived at the tournament. Cordelia immediately rushed to greet Prince Wilfred. Celine looked longingly at Cordelia and Will. Celine feels that strange pain in her chest again. Adele noticed that something had happened to Celine. Prince Louis approaches the girls. Prince Louis takes Celine's hand and promises to make her queen. Celine looks at the prince with wide eyes and wants to say something. Louis, without waiting for Celine to speak, revealed his feelings to her. Celine understands that Louis is a good man, but she does not feel reciprocity towards him. Will watches Louis closely. Celine sits alone and drinks tea. Jenna approaches Celine and whispers a message from Will. Wilfred invites Celine to go for a walk before the tournament starts. Will doesn't want to be seen with Celine, so he pulls his hood over himself. Celine and Will are walking along a secluded forest path. Celine warns Will that something always happens at the tournament, but Will just laughs it off. The prince reminds Celine that he has nothing to fear, because if he is wounded, she can heal him. Celine mentally calms down, because now she can use the power of the goddess. Will sees that Celine is not telling him something and tries to find out what happened. Without letting her finish speaking, Will rushes at Celine and demands that she keep everything a secret. Will hugs Celine because this is all just so that they can be together. Celine doesn't understand what's happening to her. Wilfred now wants to be with Celine all the time. He touches her face and then kisses her. But it's time for them to go back. The tournament is about to start. Celine feels unwell. When Will and Celine were returning from their walk, Cordelia saw them. Cordelia was simply furious. Now she wants to punish Celine. Adele asks if Celine is sick. Celine grabs her face in horror. She didn't think it would be so noticeable. Celine told her sister what was going on. After listening to Celine, Adele makes a small clarification and hits the mark. Adele doesn't have time to finish speaking because someone calls her and Celine. Cordelia approached the girls and invited them to tea. Celine, out of politeness, agrees to have tea with Cordelia, but she is tormented by the question of what Adele did not manage to finish. The girls gathered around the table and discussed the tournament. A girl approaches Celine and asks her to give her some time. Celine asks for forgiveness and leaves. Cordelia looks pleased. Celine was lying on the grass. She was coming too. Sitting on the grass, Celine tries to understand what happened. She remembered someone covering her mouth. Standing up, Celine decides to go back, but does not know which way to go. Behind her, she heard the crunch of branches and footsteps. Celine was delighted, thinking that they were the tournament participants. But one man pointed an arrow at her. An arrow flew past and slightly grazed his face. Celine realized she had to run. Celine ran so fast that she couldn't hold on and stumbled. And then an arrow stuck into the ground near her head. She stood up and looked at the arrow to see if it was lucky or if it had missed on purpose. But the men in hoods were serious. Celine realizes in horror that they are hunting, and they are hunting her. In a panic, she loses her shoe. Celine understands that they want to kill her. She is very scared. Her magic is not enough for the battle. She decides to run away. After running out of cover and running a little, Celine falls. Her offenders quickly catch up with her and want to kill her as soon as possible. Celine sits in horror, disheveled, on the grass, and her thoughts are only about death. Celine remembers her past life when she was sick, but now everything has changed. Now she is not alone. In desperation, she mentally asks Wilfred for help. Wilfred stands in front of Celine, opening his eyes from a strange sound. Will crouches down to Celine, and she realizes that he is real and not a dream. Will is very sorry that he came to the rescue too late, that Celine experienced such fear. Wilfred hugs Celine, but she only cries and can't say anything. Then the hooded men appeared again. Celine, seeing the hunters again, wants to run away again. Will reassures Celine and tells her not to worry. He will take care of everything. Will takes the owl's sword and engages in dialogue with the hunters. One of the hunters accuses Will of interfering with them. Will's gaze changes, and he holds out his hand from which comes a bright glow. Celine realizes that Wilfred also has magic. Wilfred enjoys punishing those who offend him. The second prince kills one of the hunters with his sword. Blood from the sword falls on Celine's face. The hunters, who had recently been laughing, were already asking for mercy. But Will is not going to let everyone go so easily. He kills another offender. Celine, who is watching everything, simply does not recognize Will. She has never known him like this. Celine watches in horror as Will kills people with ease. Will knows that Celine shouldn't have seen this. Will is genuinely worried about Celine and wipes the blood from her cheek with his finger. Then Wilfred jokingly asks Celine to wait a little longer because he hasn't killed everyone yet. Celine asks Will not to kill anyone else. Will doesn't understand her because they just wanted to do this to her. Celine tries to explain to Will that killing is wrong. Celine simply cannot believe her ears at how easily Will controls human lives. Wilfred actually thinks otherwise. Celine froze in horror, as this was not the first murder Will had committed. A whole bunch of thoughts and memories flash through Celine's head. She asks Will to forgive her. Will doesn't understand why Celine is apologizing and crying. Celine silently rose from the grass and walked away. After walking a little, Celine came across a bloody body. Celine rushed to help and used her goddess powers. Will doesn't understand why she's doing this, why she's healing them. When Celine finished healing, she turned to Will and looked him in the eyes. Celine expressed how she thought it should be. Celine cuddles up to Wilfred, grateful to him for saving her anyway. After everything had settled down, Celine was tormented by only one question. Who wanted her dead? Celine was surprised when she was told that she had a guest. It was Wilfred. Celine immediately jumped up from her seat in case something happened. Will tries to understand if Celine's attitude towards him has changed. Celine couldn't even think about it. She was just very busy. Will doesn't quite believe Celine as she looks down, but Celine assures him that everything between them is as before. Pressing Celine's hand to his cheek, Will is glad to hear such words, because without her, he will die. Celine believed Wilfred. Wilfred is not ready to give up killing completely. Will says something that tells Celine that he hasn't had a good time in the castle. Celine is understanding about Wilfred. Will thanks Celine for her support. Wilfred and Celine are walking in the park, but Celine is tormented by one question, and she decides to ask it. Receiving no answer, Celine realizes that she is right. After a pause, Will decides to speak. Celine realizes that she herself doesn't know how to answer. After some thought, Celine came up with an answer. Realizing that Celine will still be with him, Wilfred decides to tell her how it really was. Listening to Wilfred, Celine simply couldn't believe how this was possible. He endured all these sorrows only thanks to Celine. Celine, of course, had no intention of breaking up with Will, but Will needs something more in their relationship than they currently have. Wilfred proposes that they get married. Celine clearly didn't expect such an offer from Will, but Will already has a bride. Will says this marriage will not bring him happiness. Wilfred also shares his thoughts about Cordelia with Celine. We sat down in shock from what we heard. Wilfred doesn't insist that Celine believe him. He just needs time. Wilfred realizes that Cordelia has some kind of goal. Prince Wilfred never heard an answer from Celine about the engagement. Celine didn't even think about answering today. The second prince does not want to put pressure on Celine because he knew that their feelings for each other are different. He gives her time to think and leaves. Celine has mixed feelings about Will. As they walk to the carriage, Celine remembers everything that happened between them. because perhaps she can lose him forever, and she makes a final decision. Celine also takes upon herself her father's consent. Will asks to kiss him. The prince needs to be convinced of Celine's seriousness. This kiss took Celine by surprise, because she had never kissed anyone before. But Will is so persistent. Celine collects her thoughts. Celine's consent to the kiss clearly shocks Wilfred a little. Celine is acting stupid. Wilfred is simply confused. Will closes his eyes to make Celine feel less awkward. When Will closed his eyes, Celine just stood and watched. Celine comes closer and closer to him. Now she's at his face. But Will gets ahead of her and kisses her first. Celine instinctively covers her mouth with her hands. But then she pretends that everything was planned that way. The job is done. Will grabs her again and kisses her even harder. Wilfred laughs it off. The prince is just happy that he and Celine are serious. Celine is a little embarrassed. She still can't get over the kiss. Celine is glad that Will is happy. The girl cannot hide her embarrassment for a long time. That same day, evening in the dungeons of the castle, Richard notices that Will is in a good mood. Wilfred, meanwhile, is testing his magic on a human with a satisfied look. Richard wants to know the details. Will informed him of Celine's consent to the engagement. This was not news to the Marquise. But Richard knows Wilfred better than Celine. Will is simply afraid of losing Celine's favor. At this time, the man comes to his senses. Richard, having listened to Wilfred, is not surprised by his idea. Richard gets bored with their activity and urges Will on. Wilfred tries to find out who tried to kill Celine. The man does not give a name, but only the customer's description. Having dealt with Celine's offender, Will is not sure that this will help punish the Duchess. But for revenge, Will is satisfied with any evidence. Since everyone knows about Will and Celine's engagement, the second prince has been acting less reserved. And Celine no longer sees him as a younger brother, but as a man. When Will tries to kiss Celine again, she pushes him away, and Will is clearly unhappy. Celine deceives him that order is important to her. Will is upset. The prince persuades Celine to just one more kiss, and Celine agrees. He kisses Celine tenderly. As the first kiss slowly turns into a second, and then a third, Celine pushes Will away, but he laughs it off. Then Celine becomes furious at Will's deception. But Will hugs Celine, and she is no longer angry with him. Will continues to joke. Celine blushes at her thoughts. Celine is still prohibited from leaving the house, as the perpetrator has not yet been found. Celine pulled Will out of his thoughts. The girl is worried that she has gained weight. Celine just needs to start exercising again already. But will Celine likes anyone? Celine remembers Prince Louis. Celine realizes that it's not her looks that Will likes about her, but her personality. Wilfred shows a little jealousy. Celine is flattered by this attitude towards her from the young man. Will invites Celine to take a little trip outside the house. For Celine, this offer sounds tempting. Will is positive, but Celine doesn't think it will be that easy. To Celine's surprise, her father allows her to go with Wilfred. Celine is looking forward to the day of the trip, and Adele is going too. In the corridor, Celine meets Adele. Prince Louis arrived from the castle with Adele. Adele told Celine why Prince Louis had arrived. Celine plucked up her courage and invited Louis to talk in private. Celine invited Louis into the living room and sat down opposite him. Celine didn't know where to start. She hadn't met Louis since the day of the tournament. Louis touched on the topic of what happened at the tournament. Then Louis settled down comfortably and was ready to listen to Celine. Celine started the conversation from afar. When she finished her speech, she couldn't look him in the eye. Louis is still in a good mood. Celine speaks the truth, and then Louis's expression and tone change. Celine clearly didn't expect this. She doesn't understand what Louis is talking about. Louis's words make Celine angry. Louis was clearly confident in his words. Celine could never have imagined such a thing. But Louis, not paying attention to Celine, continues to open her eyes to Wilfred. Celine realized that Louis clearly knew something about Will. Louis tries to prove to Celine that Will is not as good as he wants to seem. Celine doesn't know what to say to refute Louis's words. Although Louis doesn't like Wilfred, He comes first for Celine. Louise walks up to Celine and kneels down in front of her. He takes her hand and tries to change her mind. Celine gets up to open the door. As soon as Celine reaches the door, Louis grabs her from behind and prevents her from opening the door. Celine tries to break free, but Louis holds her even tighter. Wilfred stands on the other side of the door. Celine knows she can't let Will see her with Louis, but staying with Louis is also dangerous. Wilfred does not leave and waits for an answer from Celine. Celine is forced to lie. Wilfred left. Louis lets her go. Celine is extremely unhappy with Louis's behavior, but Louis doesn't seem to hear her. He continues to reject her from Will. Then Celine reveals that she knows about Wilfred's murders, but for some reason, Louis started talking about her sister. Celine thought about it. Louis told Celine his truth. Celine doesn't want to believe Louis's words. Louis left, leaving Celine alone. Celine doesn't know who to trust. She needs to go, because Will is waiting for her. Celine tried her best to act as usual. Will and Adele still noticed that something had happened to Celine. Adele whispered to her that Wilfred didn't know about Louis. Celine is simply grateful for her sister's intelligence. Will looks at his sisters with suspicion the whole time. Will doesn't understand why Celine didn't sit next to him. Celine assures Will that she had no skill against him. It just happened that way. Adele changes the subject. Adele is worried that her presence will disturb the young couple. Celine is beside herself. How dare Will tell Adele such a thing? But Will is not shy about speaking his mind. Hearing about the kiss, Celine wants to shut Will up. Adele closed her eyes and screamed that she hadn't heard anything. Will bites Celine's finger. Will wants to make sure Celine is serious once again. Celine reciprocates. Celine convinces herself that Louis made it all up. Royal Castle, night. Cordelia sits in the room with a bloody knife, her face and hands covered in blood. There is a knock at the door. Cordelia is glad to hear from Louis. The girl orders her maid to clean everything up, and she goes to Prince Louis. Cordelia is upset that her engagement to Will has been delayed due to events that she herself caused. Looking at the moon, Cordelia does not lose hope for an engagement. Travel day. The young people are riding in a carriage. Celine is simply delighted that she is finally allowed to go outside the house. Celine began to guess why Will had invited Adele and why they had gone to the Marquis of Stirling's estate. Richard tries to find out from Adele how she feels about his company. Adele responds politely, but hints that she would like to know such things in advance. Celine thinks that now is the right time to thank Richard for his help. Richard responds, as befits a gentleman. They arrive at their destination. Celine is simply amazed by the beauty around her. Richard is very hospitable. Celine thinks it wouldn't hurt to greet Richard's parents first. Richard reports that he lives alone. The sisters exchange glances with each other. Oddly enough, Richard has a house full of servants. Richard has some business to take care of and leaves his guests alone. Will notices that Celine is upset. Will asks the maid to leave them alone. Wilfred tells his sisters about Richard. Adele sympathizes with Richard. Wilfred just told me a little about Richard's life. Will warns his sisters against the royal family. Richard returns, looking pleased, and wants to show his guests his house. In the evening, the girls share their impressions with each other. Celine notices sadness in Adele's eyes. Celine herself understands that it was not easy for Richard to go through everything. The girls decide not to dwell on Richard's sad past and to have some fun tomorrow. There was a knock at the door. Will didn't think Celine was alone. Adele quickly gets ready to leave, leaving the young people alone, which greatly frightens Celine. Will sat down on the bed next to Celine. Wilfred leans his head on the girl's shoulder and tells her what a wonderful time he is having with her. Celine reciprocates. Celine immediately got ready for bed, but Will isn't going to run away. Celine took it all as a game at first, but Wilfred is not joking. He offers Celine to sleep together. Celine began to look for reasons why this was wrong, but Will has studied Celine very well and knows how to get his way. Celine agrees to spend the night in the same room with Will. Night had fallen, and Celine was almost asleep. Will hugs Celine. The girl feels awkward. Celine falls asleep, and Will leaves the room. In the corridor, he meets Richard, who teases him. Will does not respond to his friend's jokes, but says that he intends to return to the castle through the teleporter. Richard doesn't try to stop his friend. Will walks into the room and touches the teleporter with his hand. The same night, the royal castle. Will finds himself in the royal castle. Having done his business in the castle, Will even managed to get some sleep. In the morning at breakfast, the Marquise asks the girls how they slept. Adele froze in horror at the Marquise's words. Celie tries to justify herself. The guys decide to go to the city. While Celine admires the beauty, Richard suggests getting down to business. He asks Adele out on a date. Adele hesitated a little. Richard explains his decision to her. Adele thought it was the right thing to do and agreed with Richard. Celine had similar thoughts about Adele at this time. Celie and Will walked into the store. Celine decides to give Will a gift. When the boys were together again, Celine asked how Adele spent her time. Wilfred offers to walk hand in hand with Celine. Everyone is in a good mood. At night, Will again arrives at the castle via teleportation. On the way to the teleport, he meets Louis. Louis is surprised to see Will in the castle. Will doesn't want to talk to Louis, but Louis continues the conversation, ignoring Will's displeasure. Prince Louis delightedly tells Will that Celine kept their meeting from him. Will wanted to go on, but Louis's words made him stop. Will remembered that day. Louis began to describe in detail how he held Celine close to him. Wilfred seemed to have lost control of himself. Will tries to kill Louis with his magic, but Louis was prepared for this turn of events and easily repels Will's attack. After weighing the pros and cons, Will stops attacking Louis. Louis is clearly surprised by his decision, but Wilfred only delayed Louis's murder. Celine woke up. Will sat in front of her, tears in his eyes. Celine rushed towards him. She didn't understand what was happening. With tears in his eyes, Will accused her of lying. Celine didn't understand anything. Will continued to speak. He was bitter. Finally, Celine understood what Wilfred was talking about. Will is waiting patiently for a response from Celine. Will doesn't let Celine say a word. Demanding an answer, Will pinned Celine to the bed and held her hands. Celine understands that she needs to tell everything, but Will was so angry that it didn't seem like Will at all. Will clutches his head. He is simply obsessed with hatred for Louis. Celine doesn't know how to comfort Wilfred. Suddenly, Will asks Celine to kiss him. Celine was simply taken aback by such a reaction. But if she refuses, she is afraid to imagine what will happen. Celine kisses Will. Wilfred calms down in Celine's arms. Wilfred asks Celine not to let any men near her anymore. Will kisses Celine again and tells her he loves her.